Eric's efforts. So
Greetings, music lovers, thrill seekers, card players all across the fruited plain. It is I, your host, BSN, having more fun than a human being should be allowed to have with half my cards tied behind my back just to make it fair, with How to Play Rush, a game for 2 players. It's an abstract card game similar to the card game Army Ants as seen here, but is a little bit more complex, a little bit more advanced, a little bit better of a game, but takes a little bit longer. This course comes to us from Paget.com, where invented card games are submitted all the time, so do check out Paget.com for invented card games. And I take a huge career risk every video I put out. I allow you, the rank amateur, to talk about anything you want in the comments. It doesn't even have to be card game related. You could write anything there. It is an extreme career risk that I am willing to take, because you, the audience, were meant to comment. So the object of this game is pretty simple. You try to get one of your cards to the exact other side of the table and off the board in the north or south end, but not the east and west. You'll need 2 miniature decks of cards. You're going to take 10 cards, see all the cards, decide where you want them to go, put them face down, and then once both players have done this, there's going to be a magic reveal, and we get to see each other's strategies, judge their board, see if there's any weaknesses we can exploit to try to get one of our cards to the other side. And this is done through a series of movements. We have moving, which allows your card to move to the north, south, east, or west as long as those spots are not occupied. So in this case here, we only have one legal move. We at no time can move diagonally or to a spot that is already occupied. The other option we have is to attack. On our move, if there's a card ahead of us in an occupied space, we may choose to attack it. We must be equal or greater than that card. We also can take 2 cards from our hand and fuse them together. That will create a new combination card, and we may place that card or any card from our hand on the board as long as we're in an empty space within the first 2 rows. We may also withdraw any card in that same space to make room. We will add it to our hand. The game, of course, ends when somebody is able to get their card to the other side. So let's go ahead and show an example. Now we're going to take 5 cards to put in our opening hand. Both players are going to do that after we've set up. And we are going to see a withdrawal. That ends the turn. And we'll see another withdrawal. We'll see a movement, and we'll see a fusion from the north. South will then decide what to do. They have 6 cards in hand, so they will fuse. So this game's pretty simple. It goes on. You try to overcome your enemies. You try to get somewhere to the other side of the board. Attacking, if both cards are of equal value, both cards will come off the board and go into a discard pile where they will not be seen again. Fusion cards, you must be careful. They can get attacked, and only the top card can get attacked for its value. So fusion cards necessarily don't move too quickly. They don't move too often. You take a great risk when doing that. And that great risk, of course, is having your fusion card captured. And when that happens, nothing good can come of it, because that's what you base most of your strategy on in this game, is having a good fusion card that you won't necessarily have to use early, but it will be somewhat defensive. You're hoping your enemies run into it as opposed to you moving it. Now, 2 fusion cards moving together, they can attack just the top card of the fusion card, leaving you the ability to attack with your bottom card that remains their top card of the fusion deck. Kings are worth 13 points, aces are worth 14, queens are worth 12, jacks are worth 11, everything else is worth its face value. So if we fuse 2 cards together, we have the weakest fusion pair, which is worth 4. It does not win against anything, it simply sits there to obstruct. Since you can't move a card into an occupied space, somebody must first attack that card if they're next to it. The movements itself, you somewhat have to be careful You'll have a lot of thought to consider with this. So now we see that king is attacked at 10 of diamonds. And now we see a fusion has come together on the board. Now we see another fusion has been placed in the chamber. If you're ever less than 5 cards in your hand, you will need to immediately replenish back up to 5. I found army ants to be pretty interesting. You can make a board for it, although it's not really necessary. All you have to remember is you have to have 5 rows, or 5 columns with 6 rows. And you have this game. It's a free game. I like using the miniature cards because there's not too often you get a chance to use miniature cards. So far, we find Island of Cards Solitaire was a great use of the miniature deck. We found a few other solitaires that might be good for that. Carpet might be good for having 2 miniature decks. So miniature decks aren't just a novelty. They do have some use in traditional gaming. It just comes to be where you find use for them. Bahama Taxi is probably a good use for a miniature deck if you don't want to have that much table space dedicated to a board. I find miniature decks to be an interesting novelty, so I own 3 of them myself. I'll probably get more in the future. They are pretty fun to play with. Not necessarily traditional card games because unless you have small hands, you won't really benefit too much from them. But I had some fun with this game. It is a little bit drawn out, and that's even just playing myself, trying to figure out what to do. And this is me speeding the video up 4 times, and it still drug on for a while, to say the least. Quite a while it drug on. But overall, it's a pretty enjoyable experience. So now we see a fusion deck moving now. Will it get attacked? What's going to happen? You see a lot of pre-positioning of assets in this game. Pre-positioning fusion, pre-positioning aces, which are worth 14. Aces can be a really strong card. So now we see a mutual attack, 2 equals, so they take both each other out. So 2 equal cards attacking, that's somewhat of a kamikaze attack. Both players lose that card. But if you like abstract games, abstract thinking, this is an interesting application of abstract strategy. And I kind of found it interesting. I really like Army Ants, so I figured, this game would be pretty interesting to try out. And it's just really easy. 5 movements, 5 actions that you can do on your turn. You can either move, you can attack, you can withdraw, you can place, or you can fuse 2 cards. And at any point in time, if you want to take a fused deck off the board, you are allowed to do that, place it in hand, and later use that other card to fuse together. But you have to remember they have to be in the first 2 rows. Otherwise, you're not really allowed to do that move. So yeah, there was a lot of movements in this. I would say playing time probably going to be about 30-45 minutes easily. Depends on how fast players realize there might be an exploit and attempt to move assets to where you may not defend them or cannot defend them. That was mainly the crux of this game, was once you had 2 10s put together, that was somewhat of a difficult asset to pass. At the same time, you also don't want to move that 20 value asset, because if you move it next to a king, an ace, a jack, or a queen, that can attack the top of the card, leaving you with the bottom of a 10, and then you're stuck moving a 10 around trying to avoid the face card. However, at the same time, face cards don't want to occupy a space next to that 20 valued asset, because if they get attacked, which they can only do if they're a space away on the move, they're going to automatically lose, because a 20-point asset is going to beat a 14-point asset or a 13-point asset or a 12-point asset. So now we're seeing the end of the game. We see the jacks moved over. They get attacked. Queen moves over. And we're going to get to the bottom of the board. And so, like always, if you like playing these games, do check out the description and look at all these channels. I'm adding a new one this week. We have a young man in Brazil that is going to teach Brazil a lot of card games. Mika Shin, do check out his channel. He also puts them in English subtitles. Do check out the Branson Board Game Cafe next time you're in the great state of Missouri, home to today's tribute. And do check out the Board Game Cafe there. Do like and subscribe. So this time last year, we lost the legend of talk radio, Rush Limbaugh. He had an audience of over 40 million listeners. Now that kind of fluctuated between 20 million to 40 million depending on the year. 40 million towards the latter part of his career. He was a legend in talk radio. Became a Hall of Fame inductee in the Missouri Hall of Great Missourians. But his habits did him in. He was a smoker early on and an avid cigar smoker. Ended up having advanced lung cancer at the end. He had a lot of controversy. I'm not going to get into every one of them, but he was a part of the opioid crisis. He exposed it to the nation when he got caught, arrested for attempting to, among other things, doctor shop and feed an opioid addiction caused from a bad back surgery he had earlier. That brought up a national conversation about opioids and their addictiveness, and then soon it was found out it wasn't necessarily the user's fault for becoming addicted, that the drug companies themselves had told everybody they were not addicted, had the FDA on board, and eventually this led to the television show, or the Hulu show, Dope Sick, which somehow managed not to cover Limbaugh's arrest. Yeah, he was born to do radio. His family, for the longest time, thought he was going to be the black sheep of the family, the least successful. They were constantly worried about him. Everybody in his family had gone to college. They were prominent lawyers. They lived a long life. And they worked till their very end of their life. They worked in old age. And Rush was just not somebody who wanted to go into law. He figured out he wanted to do radio, and he tried his hand at it, but he kept getting fired from every music job that he had, disc jockeying music. A lot of times they claimed he was talking too much or doing other things that they just did not care for, but he was eventually found a path back to radio in talk radio. It was somewhat of a new format, and he knew how to be entertaining at all times. He knew how to sell controversy, how to get people to tune in. People who tuned into a show weren't necessarily people who agreed with him. A lot of people disagreed with him, but he was so entertaining, so funny, so charismatic that you couldn't help but listen. And this highest rated show happened when people were at work. So at one point he did show that his side, who had been traditionally called the silent majority, could peacefully assemble in large numbers. He had a simple bake sale for a guy who wouldn't buy his newsletter and had it in Fort Collins, Colorado, and a lot of people showed up, an amazingly huge crowd. He endorsed Steve Forbes in the 2000 primary and figured out pretty soon his influence wasn't what he thought it was, because George W. Bush ended up winning the primary. That same year, he had gone deaf, and it actually had revealed to his audience that he hired court stenographers to transcript calls, what the callers were saying, so he could read them, because he could not hear them anymore. Eventually, he'd have to get a cochlear implant, as you see here, and that was the only way he could do a show. Normal sounds he could no longer process. Everything that he heard was because they were able to rig his studio up for the cochlear implant. 9/11 would happen later, the September 11th attacks, and he had initially opposed the creation of the TSA and the Department of Homeland Security. It's something he failed to influence high enough. It went through. We now have the TSA. He opposed war. In his 35 Undeniable Truths, he said that there's no such thing as war atrocities because war is the atrocity. And then Iraq happened, and he had to support that. The 2006 primary came, and his party, the Republican Party, lost heavily. He predicted that because of this loss, there was a lot of his side that chose not to vote for congressmen who had not stayed true to their values. And he had predicted John McCain would eventually become the Republican candidate, which did happen. The 2007 recession saw the Tea Party protests, which were the largest Republican-led protests in probably the country's history. And in 2008, Obama would win, and he would become famous for claiming that he hoped he failed. And while the left also opposed bailouts during Occupy Wall Street, we come later to find out that Lois Lerner had made the tax-exempt status of a lot of these charitable organizations that hosted and promoted these protests to be almost unable to do so. And then we saw the famously anti-war candidate start his own wars. And that's pretty much when everybody had crossed their mind that it was no chance that the Iraq War was ever going to succeed. And that's later when Limbaugh had to admit himself that Obama had succeeded in getting his agenda passed. But his critics were always misinterpreting when he said, I hope he fails, he meant he hoped he failed to get his agenda across. And that, of course, never came out to be that way. It got spun the other way. We'd see Mitt Romney fail, and that's when we'd see the rise of Donald Trump, which Rush, of course, loved. And Rush was kind of like an old man working at Walmart. Now, he had no reason to continue working in old age, but he was such a hard worker. When he got his medical diagnosis, he could have retired. He could have stopped working altogether and just enjoyed the fruits of his labor. I think most people would. I think most people look at the Walmart greeter and criticize that they usually think it's due to financial failure, which a lot of times it is, a failure to plan financially. Rush had every reason to quit working and go vacation when he found out he had a terminal illness. But he always felt in his heart the only reason he had any material wealth was his audience. And he worked every day through sickness, through some of the worst pain, to do his show because he felt like he owed the audience. He had a deep-seated love of his job and continued working even when it was painful to do so, even when getting up and trying to move around would just leave him exhausted at the end of the show. And that's why I wanted to pay tribute to today's game, named after, but not really named after, had nothing to do with him. But I just wanted to remind everybody of the hard work and devotion that Rush Limbaugh gave this country.